So we've been talking over the past few weeks about the good life and what actually leads to the good life. There are a lot of theories. There are a lot of suggestions that people make. There are a lot of things that we try to kind of squeeze the most out of life. And if we're honest, a lot of the things we try don't really give us the results we were hoping to find. So if you've been watching football recently, which I don't know why anybody would still be watching football at this point. I guess there's always next year. But if you've been watching football recently, then maybe you've seen the Allstate Mayhem commercial where Mayhem is riding an exercise bike, and as he's riding, he says something like, "Well, after riding 12 miles to nowhere, I'm taking a detour," and he catapults himself out the window. That's what the quest for the good life is like for many of us. It's like riding 12 miles to nowhere because the things that we think are going to work, things like achieving more and accumulating more and being more fit and buying better clothes and having a better job and getting better kids, they don't actually bring us the fulfillment in life that we're looking for. And so if we're not careful and if we're not intentional, we can just kind of stay stuck in this endless loop of kind of pedaling a bike but not going anywhere, of searching for the good life but never really finding it. The good news for us, though, the good news that we've talked about over the past few weeks, is the fact that according to the Gospel of John and the other writers of the New Testament, Jesus came to earth in order to help us discover what the good life is truly like, right? Not just to help us achieve the good life as we think it should be, but to completely change the paradigm that we know and to redefine our notion of what the good life is actually like and what it takes to really experience it. And so we've talked about the fact that the good life is the connected life, that if Jesus truly is the source of life, then we have to live the connected life, a life deeply connected to Jesus as the source of life. That's why things like weekly worship and daily prayer are so critical if we're looking for the good life, because they keep us connected to the source of life. They change us from the inside out. We've talked about the fact that the good life is the rooted life. It's rooted in community with one another, that God created us not as independent beings, but as interdependent beings, that we need each other. So that's why things like groups are so important. They're the place where we can surround and support each other and live the life together that God intended us to live. And then last week, we talked about the fact that the good life is the generous life. That the good life is not found in what we receive or gain for ourselves, but the good life is actually found in and through what and how we give to God. So that's why our generosity in giving is so important. It's because God hardwired us to find life, not in what we accumulate, but in what we give. And so this week, we've saved what I think is the most critical ingredient to the good life that I want to share with you. We're wrapping up this series today by talking about the greatest and most powerful paradox in life. Now, of course, you already knew the dictionary definition of the word paradox, but I had to look it up this week. A paradox is a statement that is seemingly contradictory or opposed to common sense, and yet is perhaps true. G.K. Chesterton, he was a theologian and philosopher in the early 1900s, and I love the way that he defined a paradox as truth standing on her head to get our attention. Truth standing on her head to get our attention. There are a lot of paradoxes in life. Some are in the form of a question that make you scratch your head, like can God make a rock so big that he can't move it? That's a paradox. I read this week, there's the Swiss cheese paradox. This one seems really important to me to figure out. The Swiss cheese paradox is the more holes you have, the less cheese you have. The more Swiss cheese you have, the more holes you have. Thus, the more Swiss cheese you have, the less Swiss cheese you have. Amazing, amazing. I love this one. I'll show it to you. There's the blank page paradox. You ever gotten something like this in the mail? I have. Kind of drives me bonkers. I like this one as well. It's similar to the blank page paradox. I guess this one is a road sign paradox. The reality is, so much of life as we know it is a paradox, right? Things like the more you learn, the more you realize how little you know. That's a paradox. One that's so true today is the more connected we get, the more isolated we feel. This one is so true. The more choices that you have, the harder it is to choose. This one's true for me. The more afraid you are of failing, the more likely you are to fail. This one's so important for everybody to understand in our culture today. The more you argue with someone, the less likely you'll convince them of your point of view. Another paradox is change is the only constant. Somebody once said to me, you've got to spend some to make some. And then there's one that for some reason people have been saying to me for years, talk less to say more. I don't know why people are saying that to me. There are a lot of paradoxes that we experience in life, but there's one that I think stands at the pinnacle of importance, and it comes from Jesus himself. And I want to share that with you today. There's this interaction that happens between Jesus and the disciples in the Gospel of Matthew. It's in Matthew chapter 16, and I'll read it in just a minute. And so if you've got a Bible and you want to turn and follow along at home, you can. This is a turning point moment for Jesus. So he knows his time with the disciples is coming to a close, and there are still some things that he wants to teach them. And so starting in Matthew 16:21, here's what it says. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. So the backstory here is that Jesus has just asked the disciples who people say that he is. What's the word on the street about him? And then he asks them specifically and directly, he says, who do you think I am? And Peter immediately answers, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God. Peter says, you're the King, right? And for Peter, that had some implications for what their next move should be as a group together. So in this day and time, Jerusalem was occupied by the Romans. They'd come in, they desecrated the holy places there. And the Jewish people had been waiting for a king to rise up and to take back control, to kind of renew the covenant with God, to kick the Romans out and to make things right again in the world. And so when Peter says to Jesus, you're the Messiah, in Peter's mind, Jesus is the one who's going to do that, right? And so their next logical step is a strategy session. They need a whiteboard, they need guns and ships, they need an attack plan. And so Peter huddles the disciples together. They're about to take control and seize the good life once and for all. So Jesus is going to be king. They're going to be the cabinet. They look at Jesus waiting for the signal to attack, and they were finally going to have the life that they'd always wanted to have, right? This was the moment that they were finally going to have it all, baby, right? Living in the palace. No more Romans telling them what to do. No more anybody telling them what to do. Complete freedom, servants at their disposal. Jesus multiplying food by day and turning water into wine by night. And then, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day raised to life. What? That is not how this is supposed to work, So Peter decides to kind of sort things out. He takes Jesus to the side, and Matthew says he rebukes Jesus. Rebuke is the same word that Matthew uses when he talks about Jesus casting demons out of someone. So essentially, Peter pulls Jesus aside and he treats him like he's been possessed by a demon. That's the only logical explanation for him saying that he's going to Jerusalem to die. And Jesus turned to Peter and he said, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns, right? Jesus, I think, hits the nail on the head when it comes to our search for the good life. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Jesus, in his words, he sounds reminiscent of something that God says to the people in the Old Testament book of Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 55. God says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my thoughts. So are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. Right? He's saying to Peter, listen, I understand what you're saying. I hear where you're coming from on this. I really do. But I have a perspective that's bigger than your perspective, and it's higher than your perspective on this. Like so many of those things that you spend so much time striving for, those aren't the things that you actually need. I mean, maybe in your own quest for the good life, you need to hear those same words. So in this moment, Jesus, he realizes that the disciples, they're still not quite getting the point. And so he huddles them together and he gives them what I think is the paradox of all paradoxes. It's the most critical and important paradox for anyone and everyone who's searching for the good life that God offers. Verse 24, he says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. This is the greatest paradox of the good life. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. The good life is the connected life. It's a life deeply connected to Jesus through things like worship and prayer. We've said that, right? The good life is the rooted life. It's a life that's deeply rooted in community with other people. The good life is the generous life. It's a life that's marked by giving and not by getting. But according to Jesus, in the greatest paradox of all, the good life is the surrendered life. It's the life that's fully surrendered to God. If you want to save your life, if you want to find your life, if you want to experience life, Jesus says you have to give it away. You have to fully surrender it to God. Every bit of it. And what do you need to surrender to God? What's included in the list of everything? I mean, what would happen in your life if you fully surrendered your life to God, no strings attached? What would happen to your life? What would happen to your prayer life? What would happen to your giving? What would happen to your heart? What would happen to your family? What would happen in your life if you fully surrendered yourself to Jesus? Fully surrendered, holding nothing back. Your time, your habits, your family, your finances, your words, your politics, your thoughts, your attitudes, your preferences. Right? When's the last time that you said to God, here it is, God, I surrender it all? I mean, have you ever said, here it is, God, I surrender it all? Some of us, I think when it comes to surrendering to God, some of us are like Hiru Onoda. Maybe you haven't heard of him. I'll tell you about him. Onoda was a Japanese soldier that was sent into the Philippines in 1944 as part of Japan's effort in World War II to keep the Allies from taking back the Philippines. And so he enlisted in the Japanese army when he turned 18, about just a year before the attack on Pearl Harbor. In his training, he trained as a commando intelligence officer in a training school that specialized in these unconventional military techniques, things like guerrilla warfare, survival, counterintelligence, and propaganda. At the end of his training in December 1944, he was sent to an island in the Philippines. February 1945, the American forces attacked, and they mostly defeated the Japanese soldiers who were stationed there. And so Onoda, in that moment, he found 3 other soldiers to retreat into the woods with him to begin engaging in the guerrilla warfare that he'd been trained in. So they survived on stolen rice and on meat that they'd steal from raids on local farms. They noticed about 6 months later, after going into the woods, that the fighting had decreased significantly. But what they didn't know was that on September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese army surrendered to the Allies and the war ended. And so they continued fighting, raiding farms, engaging in shootouts with local police who were sent after them. And knowing that there were no means of communication with units like this, the U.S. military began trying to communicate with them. So they dropped leaflets in Japanese explaining that the war was over. Onoda and his crew, they first found one of the leaflets in October 1945, just a month after the war ended. There were more leaflets with messages from Japanese generals at the end of 1945 that they found. But based on his prior training in propaganda, Onoda was convinced that these were just attempts to lure him out of the woods and attack him. In 1949, One of the three men with Onoda gave up and he walked away from the unit and finally surrendered in 1950, which let authorities know that there were still people fighting the war. So in 1952, the U.S. contacted Onoda's family members. They got personal photos. They got letters from family. They airdropped those across the island. Onoda found those, and he concluded that his family had been coerced into doing this by the authorities, and he still wouldn't surrender. In 1954, another of his men was shot and killed by a search party who were looking for wanted criminals. In 1972, his final ally was finally shot and killed by police while they were raiding a local village's rice silo. In 1974, a Japanese adventurer went to the Philippines in hopes of finding him. And when he found him alone in the woods, he told him that the people of Japan were worried about him and they'd wondered why he hadn't surrendered. And he said that he wouldn't surrender until a commanding officer came and relieved him of his duty. And so the Japanese government tracked down Onoda's commanding officer, who had become a bookkeeper or bookseller at that point, and they flew him to the Philippines. And on March 9th, 1974, almost 29 years after the end of the war, he emerged from the woods, still dressed in his military uniform, and he surrendered his rifle and his sword on the order of his commanding officer. Right? Onoda refused to surrender for 29 years. Multitude of reasons. He felt obligated and committed by his sense of duty to stay true to something that was actually no longer true. Right? He thought he knew better. He thought he was more well-informed. He was convinced that his way was the right way. He had convictions that his worldview and his way of life were correct, all the while missing out on 29 years of real full life back home.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
It wasn't until his commanding officer came to him and told him that if he surrendered his life, he could get it back, that he finally surrendered. Right? Some of us, when it comes to surrendering to God, we're like Hiru Onoda. Like, we think we're more well-informed. We're convinced that our way is the right way. We've got strong convictions that our worldview and our way of life are correct. All the while, we're missing out on the real, true, good life that Jesus offers to us if we will only surrender. If you flip forward a few chapters, you see that Jesus isn't asking us to do anything ourselves that he's not also willing to do. You actually see that the power and the goodness in the life of Jesus comes from his own surrender to God. Matthew 26 tells the story of the last night of the earthly life of Jesus. And on that night, he prays the ultimate prayer of surrender. Right? Jesus knows that he's about to be arrested. He knows that what he predicted to the disciples is about to come true. And so he takes the disciples to a place in a garden called Gethsemane. And he falls with his face to the ground and he prays this: "My Father, if it is possible, take this cup from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." That's the prayer of complete and total surrender to God. Right? When's the last time you prayed the prayer of the surrendered life and just said to God, "God, I want your will. Whatever it is, I want that," right? A lot of you know the old hymn, "I surrender all." It's like, "I surrender all. I surrender all," right? If I'm honest, when I sing that hymn, it's a little bit more like, "I surrender some. I surrender some." Right? What would it look like for you today? What would it look like for you today to pray a prayer of complete surrender to God? God, not my will, but yours be done. What do you not want to surrender? What are you not willing to surrender to God? Is it somebody? Is it something? Is it a habit? Is it a dream? Whatever it is that you're unwilling to surrender to God might be the very thing that's keeping you from living the good life that Jesus offers. The good life is the surrendered life. It's a life that's fully surrendered to God in every way imaginable. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. I want to pray for you today. So wherever you are, I want to ask you, if you would, to close your eyes. Just take a deep breath. Try to focus all of your attention and your energy and your affection on God in this moment. And I want to ask you, as we're getting ready to pray, what would it look like for you to live the surrendered life? What would it look like for you to say to God, God, not my will, but yours be done in every area of your life? Because I think that's the key to the good life that we've been looking for. The good life is the surrendered life. And so in this moment, we say, come, Holy Spirit. God, would you speak to us right now? Would you move in our hearts? Would you direct our minds? Would you align our will to your will? God, we come to you today, and some of us have never prayed a prayer of surrender to you. Some of us, God, we've prayed a prayer of surrender, but it's been a long time. Some of us today, God, we've prayed a partial prayer of surrender. We've given you some things, but not everything. And so, God, today in this moment, we join our voices together and our minds together and our hearts together and our lives together. And we pray the prayer that Jesus prayed in that garden. We say, Lord, not what I will, but what you will. God, today, may your will be done in our lives. Help us to lay it down, to surrender to you. Help us to experience the life that Jesus offers. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.